In the rain-drenched wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, a grief-stricken trauma surgeon sought solitude in a remote clearing, but a ragged stray dog kept appearing at his tent each night. What began as quiet mourning turned deadly when he followed, the animal deep into an uncharted forest, straight into a forgotten town that shouldn't exist. Dr. Dean Holloway wasn't your typical camper. For 15 years, he was a top-tier trauma surgeon in Seattle General, known for performing a record-breaking triple organ repair mid-crisis during a multi-vehicle disaster response. When the town's spectral enforcers and their obsessive mayor attempted to trap him inside a place untouched by time, they had no idea they were provoking a man whose hands once held life and death at the edge of seconds. Dean followed the dog's trail and reignited a forbidden ritual that would collapse a century-old temporal prison. What began as isolation in a backcountry forest became a surreal battle for time itself. The Pacific Northwest would never be the same after Dr. Holloway crossed the mist-choked ravine and confronted the eternal August of Grapevine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain in the Pacific Northwest had a voice of its own. Not the gentle patter that lulled city dwellers to sleep, but a persistent, ancient whisper that seemed to carry secrets from one towering Douglas fir to another. Dr. Dean Holloway had come to appreciate this voice during his 17 days in the wilderness. It was honest, unlike the platitudes that had followed him from Seattle. Taking time for yourself is important, Dean. No one blames you, Dean. These things happen, Dean. He tightened the final guy line on his tent with practiced efficiency, securing it against the evening drizzle. His campsite lay in a small clearing, far enough from any trail that the ranger who'd reluctantly provided his backcountry permit had raised an eyebrow. "Pretty remote up there," she'd said. "That's the point," Dean had replied. 300 miles from the hospital. 300 miles from the surgical suite where 8-year-old Mia Cortez had bled out under his hands, despite every protocol followed perfectly. 300 miles wasn't far enough. Dean checked his watch. 6:43 p.m. Already the forest was darkening, shadows lengthening beneath the ancient conifers. He struck a match and lit his compact stove, setting a pot of water to boil. Dinner would be the same as last night, instant noodles with dehydrated vegetables. His colleagues would have laughed to see the renowned trauma surgeon reduced to such basics, but Dean found relief in the simplicity. Cut away the excess. Focus on survival. Don't think about Mia. Don't think about Jacob. His son's face appeared anyway, unbidden. Jacob's 5th birthday, blowing out candles, his small hands clapping with delight. Jacob's favorite stuffed bear, clutched tightly through every night in the hospital. Jacob's final breath, 3 years ago this month. Dean's hands trembled slightly as he poured the boiling water into his cup. The noodles softened, steam rising like ghosts in the cool evening air. He settled onto a flat stone by his tent entrance, eating mechanically, tasting nothing. Night sounds emerged, an owl's questioning hoot, the rustling of small creatures, the continuing symphony of raindrops on leaves. Something else too, a crack of a branch that was too deliberate, too heavy. Dean froze, fork halfway to his mouth. He scanned the tree line, squinting into the gathering darkness. Nothing moved. He reached for his flashlight, switching it on with a click that seemed unnaturally loud. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating droplets suspended in air before, landing on a pair of eyes at the forest's edge, yellow-green, unblinking, watching. A dog stood there, not the robust, friendly kind that hikers sometimes brought along, but a lean, rough-coated creature with matted fur that might once have been gray or brown. Its ears stood at attention, one notched as if from an old fight. Despite its ragged appearance, the animal held itself with a strange dignity, neither approaching nor retreating. "Hey!" Dean called, his voice sounding foreign after days of near silence. "Get out of here." The dog didn't move. It simply watched, as if Dean were the curiosity, not the other way around. "I said go on." Dean stood, waving his arms. "Go home." The irony wasn't lost on him, telling a stray to go to a place it didn't have. The dog blinked once slowly, then melted back into the darkness between the trees. Dean sat back down, suddenly aware of his racing pulse. Had he really been frightened by a stray dog? He was a man who had held human hearts in his hands, who had made split-second decisions that determined whether someone lived or died. And yet here, alone in the wilderness, a silent canine observer had unsettled him deeply. He finished his noodles and secured his food in the bear canister, positioning it far from his tent. As he crawled into his sleeping bag, Dean found himself listening for sounds of the dog's return. None came, and eventually, the rhythm of rain lulled him to sleep. The dog was back the next night, and the next. Each evening as dusk settled, it would appear at the edge of the clearing, always in the same spot, always with the same unnerving stillness. It never approached while Dean was awake, never barked or whined for food. It simply watched. On the fourth night, Dean left a few bites of his freeze-dried beef stew on a plate several yards from his tent before retreating inside. Through a small gap in the tent flap, he observed as the dog finally moved forward, hesitant but deliberate. It sniffed the offering, looked toward the tent as if aware of Dean's surveillance, then quickly consumed the food before disappearing once more. Into the forest. "You need a name," Dean murmured to himself. "Can't just keep calling you dog in my head." The creature's rough coat, bristling in patches where it had clearly endured hardship, gave Dean his answer. "Bristle," he decided. "That's what I'll call you." By the seventh night, their routine had settled into something resembling companionship. Dean would cook his simple meal, leaving a portion for Bristle. The dog would emerge from the trees precisely at dusk, eat what was offered, then settle at the edge of the clearing. Sometimes it would stay for hours, sometimes only minutes. Dean found himself talking occasionally, brief observations about the weather, memories of medical school, nothing important, nothing about Jacob or Mia or the divorce papers sitting unsigned in his Seattle apartment. On the 10th day, Dean awoke to find Bristle sitting just outside his tent, closer than the dog had ever ventured before. For a long moment, they regarded each other through the mesh window, the man and the stray, both lost in their own ways. When Dean emerged from the tent, Bristle retreated, but only to the fallen log that marked the boundary of the campsite. Progress, Dean thought. A strange warmth spread through his chest, the first genuine feeling besides grief he'd experienced in months. That night, Bristle sat only 15 feet from Dean's fire. The next night, 10 feet. By the 14th evening, the dog rested just beyond arm's reach, the firelight playing across its scarred face. Dean could see now that Bristle was older than he'd first thought, with gray frosting the muzzle and a certain weariness in those intelligent eyes. There was something almost human in the way the dog observed him, not with the simple curiosity of an animal, but with what Dean could only describe as understanding. On the 17th morning, Dean emerged from his tent to find the clearing empty. He called for Bristle, his voice echoing oddly in the misty air. No response, no rustle of movement in the underbrush. For the first time since arriving, the silence of the forest felt oppressive rather than peaceful. Dean went about his morning routine, filtering water, eating a breakfast bar, checking his supplies, all the while scanning the tree line for his companion. By noon, a knot of worry had formed in his stomach. By evening, concern had hardened into certainty. Something was wrong. As dusk approached with no sign of Bristle, Dean found himself pacing the perimeter of his camp. The dog had become a fixture in his isolated existence, a silent witness to his self-imposed exile. Its absence left a void that echoed with uncomfortable familiarity. Just before nightfall, Dean noticed something he'd overlooked in his earlier circuits of the camp. A set of paw prints in a patch of mud, leading away from the clearing. They headed not toward the trail, but deeper into the uncharted forest, where the trees grew closer together and even the rangers rarely ventured. Dean stood at the edge of his camp, staring down the faint trail of prints that disappeared into the gathering darkness. Behind him lay his tent, his supplies, his carefully constructed refuge from the world. Ahead lay unknown wilderness and a mystery he couldn't explain, even to himself, why he needed to solve. The old Dean would have stayed put, would have chosen safety and logic over impulse. But that Dean had died on an operating table with a child he couldn't save. Decision made, Dean grabbed his pack, headlamp, and walking stick. He would follow Bristle's trail at first light. Whatever had drawn the dog into the depths of the forest pulled at him too now, a tether he couldn't see but somehow couldn't break. That night, Dean dreamed of Jacob standing at the edge of an unfamiliar ravine, holding a dog's leash in his small hand, beckoning his father forward with a smile that felt both like forgiveness and warning. Dawn broke reluctantly through a veil of fog as Dean set out, backpack secured tightly against his shoulders. The air hung dense and still between the ancient trees, muffling his footsteps on the damp forest floor. He'd spent years navigating the precise geography of human anatomy. But here, tracking a stray dog through uncharted wilderness, Dean felt his confidence waver. The paw prints remained distinct in patches of mud, heading northwest away from any established trail. Dean checked his compass, marked his path with small cairns of stacked stones, and pressed forward. His medical training asserted itself. In methodical observation, the prints were fresh, the stride pattern consistent, no signs of injury or distress. Just a dog moving with purpose toward something. By midday, the terrain had grown steeper, more challenging. Fallen trees blocked natural pathways, forcing Dean to climb over massive moss-covered trunks. The forest had changed subtly, fewer Douglas firs, more gnarled cedars with twisted branches that seemed to reach for him as he passed. The undergrowth thickened, ferns giving way to thorny brush that tore at his pants. Still, Bristle's trail continued. "This doesn't make sense," Dean muttered to himself, pausing to catch his breath. No dog travels this far without reason. Unless it wasn't a stray at all. Perhaps Bristle belonged to someone deep in these woods, a hermit or off-grid survivalist. The thought brought both relief and a strange disappointment. Dean had imagined himself and the dog as kindred spirits, both untethered. The idea that Bristle might have a home and attachment made Dean question why that bothered him so much. 3 hours into his trek, the mist began to thicken, swirling around tree trunks in unnaturally perfect spirals. Sound dampened further. Even the occasional birdsong seemed to come from much farther away than it should. Dean checked his GPS unit, only to find the screen flickering, coordinates jumping erratically before the device went dark altogether. "Perfect," he sighed, tucking it back into his pocket. He'd have to rely on his cairns and compass for the return journey. The compass, however, had its own ideas. The needle spun lazily, settling briefly in one direction before drifting to another. Dean tapped the casing, checked for nearby metal objects, but found no explanation for the malfunction. A flutter of unease crept up his spine. 20 years of scientific training warned that technology could fail, but compasses were simple instruments. They didn't just stop working. He pressed on, following the increasingly sporadic paw prints, guided now more by intuition than tracking skill. The fog thickened until visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Trees loomed and vanished like ships at sea. Time seemed to stretch and contract with each step, minutes blending into what felt like hours. Then suddenly, Dean heard it. Soft whine carried on the mist, familiar yet distressed. "Bristle?" he called out, moving toward the sound. The fog parted momentarily, revealing a steep slope ahead. Dean carefully navigated downward using roots and rocks as handholds. At the bottom, the landscape opened into a narrow ravine, perhaps 30 feet across. Mist pooled in its depths, like water, ethereal and strangely luminescent despite the dimming daylight. On the opposite side stood Bristle. The dog's fur was matted with something dark that Dean's medical eye immediately recognized as blood. A gash ran along the animal's left flank, not life-threatening but significant. Bristle pawed anxiously at the ground, whining again with more urgency. "Easy, boy," Dean called, relief flooding through him. "I'm coming." Between them lay the ravine, its sides too steep and unstable for a direct descent and climb. But spanning, The gap was a fallen tree stripped of branches, creating a natural if precarious bridge. Dean frowned. He'd hiked extensively throughout the Pacific Northwest and studied topographical maps before his trip. No ravine this substantial should exist here. A sound rippled through the mist, indistinct halfway between whisper and wind. Bristle's ears perked up, his body tense. Dean strained to listen. There it was again. Not words exactly, but something with cadence, with intent. The rational part of his brain suggested wind through rock formations or water over stones. The part that had watched his son die insisted it was something else entirely. Bristle barked once, the first vocal sound Dean had heard from him, then turned and limped across the log bridge, disappearing into the mist on the far side. "Wait!" Dean called, but the dog was gone. He approached the fallen tree, testing its stability with one foot. It shifted slightly but held firm. Looking down, he couldn't see the bottom of the ravine through the thick mist. It could be 10 feet down or 100. The afternoon light had taken on a strange quality, filtering through the fog in muted amber tones that shouldn't be possible at this time of day. The whispering sounds continued, rising and falling like distant conversation. Dean's logical mind cataloged explanations: water, wind, stress-induced auditory hallucinations. None fit perfectly. In the operating room, Dean had always trusted his instincts. When a patient was crashing and protocols conflicted, something deeper than training would guide his hands. That same instinct now screamed that crossing this bridge was wrong, that what waited on the other side wasn't meant for him. But Bristle was injured, and something in those intelligent eyes had asked for his help. "The things I do for a stray dog," Dean muttered, stepping fully onto the log. The crossing took less than a minute but felt eternal. With each step, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against Dean's skin like gentle hands trying to hold him back. The mist swirled more actively around his ankles, almost sentient in its movements. The whispering grew louder, then abruptly ceased as Dean reached the other side. He turned back to look at the ravine and froze. It was closing. Not physically. The ravine itself remained, but the space he'd just traversed was filling with an opaque wall of mist that solidified before his eyes. Within seconds, he could no longer see the log bridge or the path he'd traveled. The wall of mist stood unnaturally straight, defying wind and physics with its perfect vertical boundary. Dean reached out a hand, expecting to meet only vapor. Instead, his fingers encountered resistance, not solid but not intangible either, like pushing through gelatin that reformed instantly behind his touch. "This isn't possible," he whispered. Physician's mind racing through explanations, hallucinations from wild mushroom spores, carbon dioxide pockets, exhaustion-induced delirium. A soft whine pulled his attention away from the impossible barrier. Bristle stood 20 feet ahead, blood still seeping from his wound, eyes fixed on Dean with unmistakable intention. "Let me help you," Dean said, slipping off his backpack to retrieve his first aid kit. Bristle backed away, maintaining the distance between them. "Come on," Dean coaxed, pulling out gauze and antiseptic. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog turned and limped forward a few paces, then looked back expectantly. Dean sighed, repacking the medical supplies. "Fine. Your way first. Then we deal with that wound." As he followed Bristle deeper into the woods, Dean noticed the forest had changed dramatically. The trees here were different. Older, more gnarled, with species he didn't recognize from his extensive wilderness training. The undergrowth had thinned to almost nothing. No ferns, no bushes, just bare earth covered with a carpet of leaves that made no sound when crushed underfoot. The silence was absolute. No birds called, no insects hummed. Even the rustle of leaves in the canopy had ceased, though Dean could see branches moving in an unfelt wind. The light had shifted too, darker, tinged with an unnatural bluish cast that reminded Dean of the fluorescent lights in hospital corridors. It wasn't night, not yet, but neither was it any quality of daylight he'd ever experienced. The colors around him seemed simultaneously muted and too intense, like an old photograph that had been artificially enhanced. Dean walked for what his Watch insisted was only 15 minutes but felt far longer. Bristle remained just ahead, a gray-brown ghost flickering between shadow and strange light. Finally, the trees thinned, opening onto what had once been a road, now little more than two parallel ruts overgrown with weeds and bisected by sapling trees that shouldn't have been able to take root in a regularly used path. Bristle stopped, looking back at Dean with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. Dean stepped forward onto the road and saw it, a weathered wooden sign, tilted on its post, letters faded but still legible beneath a coating of emerald moss. Welcome to Grapevine Pop 317, founded 1891 below, in smaller hand-painted lettering that appeared more recent than the rest. The town that time remembers. Grapevine, Dean repeated quietly. The name tugged at something in his memory. A conversation overheard, perhaps, or a footnote in a hiking guide. He turned to ask Bristle about the wound again, but the dog had already started down the road, limping slightly but moving with clear purpose toward what Dean now realized were the outlines of buildings in the distance, silhouetted against the increasingly twilight sky. Dean looked back at the forest, at the impossible mist barrier he knew concealed the ravine. Every scientific instinct told him to turn around, to at least try to find his way back to his camp. But the same instinct that had guided his surgeon's hands now pushed him forward, toward the town that shouldn't exist. With a deep breath that did nothing to quiet his unease, Dean Holloway stepped fully onto the road to Grapevine, unaware that, like the ravine behind him, the path back to his world had already begun to close. Dean followed the overgrown road, into Grapevine with Bristle limping steadily ahead. As they approached the town proper, the strange blue-tinged twilight revealed a main street that could have been plucked from an antique photograph. Wooden sidewalks, false-fronted buildings, gas lamps that flickered with actual flame rather than electricity, but something was profoundly wrong with this picture. The town wasn't a ruin as it should have been after a century of abandonment. The paint wasn't peeling. The wood wasn't rotting. Everything looked paused, as if someone had stopped time at the height of Grapevine's prosperity and then simply walked away. "Hello?" Dean called, his voice falling unnaturally flat in the still air. No echo, no response. Bristle trotted ahead to a building marked General Store, its display window intact and filled with goods. Dean peered inside, expecting dust-covered artifacts. Instead, he saw neatly arranged canned goods, bolts of fabric, and tools, all vintage but pristine. A newspaper lay open on the counter. Dean couldn't read the headline from outside, but the sepia-toned photographs were clearly from another era. "This is impossible," he murmured. Bristle whined, drawing Dean's attention to the wound on his flank. The bleeding had slowed, but hadn't stopped. "All right, let's take care of you first," Dean said, grateful for a concrete problem he could actually solve. He led Bristle to a covered porch and coaxed the dog to lie down. The animal complied with unusual docility as Dean cleaned the gash, a 4-inch laceration, deep but clean, as if made by a sharp blade rather than the tearing of brambles or animal claws. Throughout the procedure, Bristle remained eerily still, those intelligent eyes fixed on Dean's face. "What happened to you?" Dean asked softly, applying the last of the bandage. "What is this place?" Bristle stood, shook himself once and continued down the main street. Dean followed reluctantly, his unease growing with each step. The buildings formed a perfect small-town tableau. Barbershop, post office, tailor, hardware store, a small cinema with The Hunchback of Notre Dame advertised on its marquee. A film from 1923, Dean recalled. The year on the welcome sign. He stopped at an office with Grapevine Gazette painted in gold letters on the window. Inside, an old-fashioned printing press stood frozen mid-operation, a half-printed page still, clamped in its mechanism. On the wall hung a calendar. Dean pressed his face against the glass to read it. August 3rd, 1923. Circled in red. A sound made him turn, the distinct chime of a clock tower striking the hour. 5 deep, resonant tones rang out across the silent town. Dean checked his watch. 5 p.m. exactly. Yet his modern timepiece seemed to hesitate between ticks, the second-hand stuttering as if struggling against some invisible resistance. Bristle had vanished. Dean called for him, walking faster now, scanning doorways and alleys. He passed a small park with a bandstand, a hitching post with no horses, a row of houses with rocking chairs on their porches, chairs that moved gently though there was no wind. At the far end of the street stood a white clapboard building with a bell tower, a schoolhouse. Its windows glowed with warm light, the only building that showed any signs of life. Dean approached cautiously, climbing the worn steps to the entrance. The door opened with surprising ease, releasing the scent of chalk dust and old books. He stepped into a central hallway lined with coat hooks mounted at children's height. Small boots and jackets hung there, not aged or decayed, but as if their owners had just stepped away. "Hello?" Dean called again. "Anybody here?" A soft voice answered from the last room on the left. "We've been waiting for you, Dr. Holloway." Dean froze. He hadn't told anyone in town his name or profession. Drawing on years of facing unexpected crises in the ER, Dean composed himself and walked toward the voice. The classroom door stood ajar. He pushed it open. Inside, rows of desks faced a large chalkboard covered with elegant handwriting, mathematics equations from another century. A globe that showed an outdated world map turned slowly on its axis without being touched. And at the teacher's desk sat a woman in her 40s, hands folded neatly before her, as if she'd been sitting there for hours or decades, awaiting his arrival. Her dress was vintage, her hair styled in a simple bob popular in the 1920s. But it was her eyes that caught Dean's attention, pale blue, clear, and impossibly knowing. Beside her desk sat Bristle, wound-bandaged, expression alert. "I see you've already tended to Eli," the woman said, gesturing to the dog. "You have a healer's hands, like your great-grandfather." Dean remained in the doorway, poised between entering fully and running. "Who are you? How do you know my name?" The woman smiled gently. "I'm Clara Marin. I taught here when Grapevine was still connected to your world. As for how I know you..." She paused, studying him. "You have Ezra's eyes, the Holloway look." "Ezra?" The name stirred something in Dean's memory. A family story, perhaps, or a name in his grandmother's genealogy research. Dr. Ezra Holloway, the last physician to practice in Grapevine. Clara stood, smoothing her skirt. "Your great-grandfather, if I'm not mistaken. He was here when it happened." "When what happened?" Clara moved to the windows, drawing the shades. "When Grapevine stepped outside of time." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if describing nothing more unusual than a change in weather. "August 3rd, 1923. That's when we departed, I suppose you could say." Dean's medical training asserted itself, cataloging possibilities: mass delusion, elaborate historical recreation, hallucinogenic exposure, brain tumor affecting his perception. None explained how this woman knew his name or lineage. "This isn't possible," he said for what felt like the 100th time that day. "Towns don't just step outside of time, and even if something happened in 1923, you couldn't be..." "The same Clara Marin?" She finished for him. "I assure you I am. We don't age here, Dr. Holloway. We don't change. We don't die." A shadow crossed her face. "That's the problem." The classroom clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Dean noticed it was synchronized perfectly with the stuttering of his own watch, both reading 5:17 p.m. "You need to leave, Dr. Holloway," Clara said suddenly, urgency replacing her calm demeanor. "Before sundown. The ravine sometimes reappears. At dusk, if you hurry..." "Why would I want to leave before understanding what's happening here?" Dean interrupted. "If this is some kind of elaborate hoax..." "It's not a hoax," Clara said sharply. "And you cannot be here after dark. Not on your first night. The others will know you've arrived, and Jonah will..." She stopped herself. "Please, for your own safety." Bristle stood, hackles raised slightly, eyes fixed on the classroom door. Dean turned to look. Nothing was there, but the air in the hallway seemed to thicken, darkening like ink diffusing in water. "Too late," Clara whispered. "The sun has set." Outside, the clock tower began to chime again, 6 deep resonant tones. But as the final note faded, another sound replaced it. A bell, different in pitch, ringing in slow, deliberate strokes. Clara's face drained of color. "Curfew," she breathed. "Curfew for what?" Dean demanded. "For those who remember," she said, cryptically, gathering papers from her desk with trembling hands. "You must hide, quickly. Come with me." "I'm not hiding from anything until I get some answers," Dean insisted, his patience wearing thin. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Clara moved to stand directly before him, her eyes suddenly fierce. "Listen carefully, Dr. Holloway. Your great-grandfather tried to save us and failed. Now you're here, which means either salvation or something far worse. But if Jonah finds you tonight before you understand what you're facing, none of it will matter." The curfew bell continued to toll. 9, 10, 11 strokes. "They're counting," Clara whispered. "Always counting." Through the window, Dean saw movement on the street for the first time. Figures emerging from buildings, walking with uncanny synchronization toward the town center. Their faces were indistinct in the gathering darkness, but something about their gait made Dean's skin crawl. The bell tolled a 12th time, then silence. "Too late to hide," Clara said, resignation in her voice. "But perhaps—" She pressed something into Dean's hand, a small brass key. "The clinic. Your great-grandfather's office. 2 blocks east, green door. Go there if we're separated. The journal is waiting for you." Before Dean could respond, the classroom plunged into total darkness. He heard Clara gasp, felt bristle press against his leg, then nothing. The presence of both woman and dog vanished as if they'd never been there at all. Dean fumbled for his flashlight, clicked it on. The beam illuminated empty desks, the abandoned teacher's station, equations still perfect on the board. No sign of Clara or Bristle. Outside, the streets of Grayvine had transformed. Gas lamps cast pools of sickly yellow light on vacant sidewalks. The figures Dean had seen were gone. Every building stood dark and silent, as if the entire town held its breath. Dean walked to the schoolhouse door and looked out at the abandoned street. The way back to the forest, to the ravine, to his world, lay in darkness. Even if he could find it, Clara's words suggested the mysterious crossing had closed. He was trapped in Grayvine for the night. The brass key felt unnaturally heavy in his palm as Dean stepped into the street. 2 blocks east, green door. He had no idea what waited for him there, but in a town where nothing made sense, his great-grandfather's clinic seemed as good a destination as any. Dean set off through the uncanny stillness, unable to shake the feeling that behind every darkened window unseen eyes watched his progress. Dean moved cautiously through Grayvine's darkened streets, the brass key clutched tightly in his hand. The night air hung unnaturally still, neither warm nor cold, as if temperature itself had been suspended along with time. Overhead, stars glittered, in patterns he recognized, yet they remained fixed, unmoving in a sky that should have shown the slow celestial rotation he'd observed during his camping nights. 2 blocks east, Clara had said. Dean counted intersections, grateful for the town's orderly grid. The clinic wasn't difficult to find, a modest 2-story building with Dr. E. Holloway, physician and surgeon, painted in faded gold lettering on the window. The green door stood out against whitewashed clapboard, its brass handle tarnished but intact. Dean hesitated, keys poised at the lock. This building had belonged to his great-grandfather, a man he knew only from a handful of faded photographs, and family stories about a promising doctor who had vanished without a trace. His grandmother had mentioned it occasionally. Father was establishing a practice in some small timber town when he disappeared. Mother never even got a body to bury. The key slid into the lock and turned with surprising ease as if it had been recently oiled. The door swung open on silent hinges, revealing a tidy reception area illuminated only by moonlight filtering through Venetian blinds. Antique chairs lined the walls, and an appointment book lay open on a small desk. Dean's flashlight beam caught. The last entry, August 3rd, Eli Blackwood, 10 a.m., fever recurring. He moved deeper into the clinic, finding an examination room with equipment that would have been state-of-the-art in the 1920s, but belonged in a museum now. Everything was meticulously arranged, waiting for a physician who had vanished a century ago. A steep staircase led to the second floor, living quarters, Dean assumed. He climbed slowly, floorboards somehow silent beneath his weight. The upper level contained a small apartment, kitchenette, sitting area, bedroom, all unnervingly preserved, as if his great-grandfather might return at any moment to hang his coat on the rack by the door. On a writing desk beneath the window sat a leather-bound book. Dean approached it carefully. The journal, it had to be. He reached out, then froze as movement caught his eye outside the window. A shadow passed along the street below, elongated, distorted, moving independently of any visible source. As Dean watched, it paused directly before the clinic, stretching upward as if sensing his presence. Then came another shadow, and another, each moving with deliberate, predatory slowness. They gathered beneath the window, undulating like liquid darkness. Dean stepped back from the window, heart pounding. The shadows lingered for what seemed like hours, but might have been minutes in this place where time had lost meaning. Eventually, they slithered away, continuing their silent patrol. When he was certain they had gone, Dean returned to the desk and opened the journal. The first page bore an inscription in precise handwriting. Property of Ezra James Holloway, M.D., Grapevine, Washington, April 12, 1923. He had just begun to turn to the next page when a sharp knock echoed from downstairs. Dean froze, listening as the clinic door opened. Heavy footsteps crossed the reception area, deliberate and unhurried. "Dr. Holloway," a deep voice called. "I know you're here. Best come down now. Mayor Pike wants a word." Dean considered his options: hide, flee, or confront. The decision was made for him when he heard the unmistakable sound of a revolver being cocked. "Don't make me come up there, Doctor." Dean slipped the journal into his jacket pocket. "I'm coming down," he called, keeping his voice steady. No need for weapons. At the bottom of the stairs stood a tall man in an antiquated sheriff's uniform. His weathered face suggested late 40s, with hard eyes that had seen too much and a mouth set in a grim line. The badge on his chest read, Sheriff C. Harlan, and the revolver in his hand, a Colt model that belonged in a Western, was pointed unwaveringly at Dean's chest. "You're not Ezra," the sheriff said, surprise briefly crossing his face. "But you've got the look." "I'm Dean Holloway," he replied. "Ezra was my great-grandfather." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Then you might be even worse news than we thought. Come along quietly now. The town's waiting." "Waiting for what?" Dean asked, but Sheriff Harlan merely gestured with his revolver toward the door. They walked in silence through streets now illuminated by an unnaturally bright moon. The shadows Dean had seen earlier darted between buildings, always just at the edge of vision. The town remained eerily silent except for their footsteps and the distant, endless ticking of the clock tower. Their destination was a stately building in the town center, brick-fronted with columns and a sign declaring it Grapevine Town Hall, Eastern to 1891. Light spilled from its windows, and the murmur of voices carried to the street. "In you go," Harlan said, holstering his weapon but keeping a firm hand on Dean's shoulder. The main chamber of the town hall was filled with people, perhaps 40 of them, dressed in styles spanning the early 1920s. They fell silent as Dean entered, every face turning to study him with expressions ranging from fear to curiosity to open hostility. At the front of the room, behind a polished wooden podium, stood a man in his 30s with carefully parted hair and a tailored suit. His handsome features might have been charismatic if not for the coldness in his eyes and the tight set of his jaw. "Our visitor has arrived," the man announced. "Thank you, Curtis." Sheriff Harlan nodded curtly, then took a position near the door. his discomfort evident in the way he avoided meeting Dean's eyes. "I am Jonah Pike, mayor of Grapevine," the man at the podium continued. "And you are trespassing in a delicate situation, Mr. Holloway." "Dr. Holloway," Dean corrected automatically, "and I didn't exactly choose to come here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jonah silenced it with a raised hand. "Doctor, is it? Like your ancestor?" Pike's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The man whose actions cost us our connection to the world. How fitting that another Holloway doctor should appear just as we approach the centennial." Dean scanned the faces in the crowd looking for Clara. He found her near the back, her expression carefully neutral. No sign of bristle. "I don't know what you think my great-grandfather did," Dean said, "but I came here following a stray dog. That's all." Laughter erupted from Pike, brittle and sharp. "A stray dog. He means Eli, of course." More murmurs from the crowd. "Tell me, Dr. Holloway, did your family maintain the pretense that Ezra simply vanished? Or did they acknowledge what he unleashed here?" "Jonah," a woman's voice called from the assembly. Clara stepped forward. "He doesn't know. It's not fair to—" "Fair?" Pike interrupted, his composure cracking slightly. "Was it fair when we were abandoned by time? When we watched the world move on without us through the mirrors? When we realized we couldn't die?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Dean noticed that some of them seemed to move oddly, with subtle starts and stops, as if their movements were being played at the wrong speed. Others appeared completely normal, watching the proceedings with weary resignation. "I don't understand what's happening here," Dean said, addressing the room at large. "But I'm not responsible for whatever occurred in 1923. "Perhaps not directly," Pike conceded. "But blood has meaning in Grapevine. Time has meaning. And your arrival now of all moments has meaning that cannot be ignored." As Pike spoke, Dean felt a slight weight press against his leg. Looking down, he was startled to see Bristle sitting beside him, though he hadn't noticed the dog enter. The animal's eyes were fixed on Pike with unmistakable hostility. "The dog has chosen him," someone whispered loudly enough for all to hear. Pike's face hardened. "The matter will be decided tomorrow. For tonight, Dr. Holloway will be confined to his ancestor's clinic. Sheriff Harlan will stand guard. The rest of you return to your homes. Remember the rules of the loop. No wandering after midnight, no attempts to access the mirrors without authorization, no discussion of the outside with our guest." As the crowd dispersed, Clara moved closer to Dean. Under the pretense of straightening his jacket, she leaned in and whispered, "The journal will explain. Your family began this, but you might end it. Trust Eli." She pressed something into his hand, a folded piece of paper, before Sheriff Harlan stepped between them. "That's enough, Clara," the sheriff said, his voice gentler than Dean would have expected. Dean was escorted back to the clinic in silence, Bristle following at a distance until Harlan shooed the dog away at the door. Once inside, the sheriff took up position on the porch, tipping his hat in a gesture that seemed part apology, part warning. Alone in his great-grandfather's quarters, Dean removed the journal from his pocket along with Clara's folded note. The note contained a single sentence, "Read entry 17 first." Dean found the page quickly. The handwriting here was more hurried, less precise than the inscription. May 28, 1923. "The town council has approved Pike's proposal for the mirror bind ritual, despite my objections. They believe it will bring prosperity through some manipulation of time itself. I've studied the ancient text they discovered in the mine, and I fear they misunderstand its warnings. This isn't about bending time. It's about stepping outside it entirely. I've tried to explain the dangers, but Jonah has them all convinced. The apparatus is already under construction beneath the clock tower. Mirror panels, red quartz from the mine, mechanisms I can't fathom. My one ally is young Eli Blackwood, who's been helping me prepare a countermeasure should the ritual go wrong. The boy is clever. Too clever, perhaps, for his own good. He says he's seen things in the mirrors, already reflections of what might be. I pray we're wrong about the consequences, but I've begun to store supplies for an exodus if necessary. If the worst happens, we'll need to move quickly." Dean closed the journal, mind reeling. Mirrors, rituals, time manipulation. It sounded like madness, yet he was standing in a town that existed outside of normal time, filled with people who hadn't aged in a century. And Eli, the boy his great-grandfather mentioned. Could he somehow be connected to Bristle? The dog who had led Dean here for reasons he still couldn't fathom? Dean looked out the window at Sheriff Harlan's silhouette on the porch. Beyond him, the unmoving stars hung in a sky that defied nature's laws. He thought of the shadows that moved independently, the people who stuttered through time, and Mayor Pike's cold, controlling presence. He thought of Clara's words, "Your family began this, but you might end it." Settled at the desk that had once belonged to his great-grandfather, Dean opened the journal again, determined to read every word, to understand what Ezra had discovered, and what he himself might be destined to finish. Dean spent the night poring over his great-grandfather's journal by lamplight, each entry unraveling another thread of Gravine's impossible history. Ezra's handwriting grew increasingly frantic as August 3, 1923 approached, detailing his desperate attempts to convince the town council that the mirror-bind ritual would end in catastrophe. The final entry, dated the morning of August 3rd, simply read, "They proceed tonight. I've hidden the countermeasure components where only Eli knows to look. If we fail to stop the ritual, perhaps someone will find them in time. May God forgive us all for what we've done." Dawn arrived abruptly in Gravine, not the gradual lightening of the sky, but a sudden shift from night to day, as if someone had flipped a switch. Dean startled awake at his great-grandfather's desk, the journal open beneath his cheek. Sheriff Harlan was gone from his post on the porch. The brass key Clara had given him lay beside an empty coffee cup, an artifact of his uneasy vigil. Dean tucked the journal inside his jacket and ventured downstairs. The clinic door stood unlocked. Outside, Gravine had transformed again. People walked the streets, shops appeared open, the clock tower chimed 8 times. The town was alive, yet profoundly wrong. Watching the residents more carefully now, Dean noticed how some moved with mechanical precision while others seemed to skip frames like damaged film. A woman watered flowers that never grew. A man swept a sidewalk that gathered no dust. Remembering Pike's decree, Dean knew he needed to keep a low profile until he understood more. He slipped from the clinic and made his way toward the clock tower, the most likely location of the apparatus Ezra had described. If the heart of this time anomaly existed anywhere, it would be there. The base of the clock tower housed the town's mechanical workshop, according to a weathered sign. Dean peered through a grease-smudged window, seeing workbenches, tools, and what appeared to be parts of a dismantled locomotive engine. As he was about to move on, the door swung open. "You planning to stand there gawking all day, Holloway?" A woman in her late teens or early 20s stood in the doorway, wiping oil-stained hands on overalls that had been patched multiple times. Her dark hair was cut short, in a style that would have been scandalously boyish for 1923, and her expression carried equal measures of suspicion and curiosity. "I was just," Dean began. "Snooping," she finished for him. "Looking for a way under the tower, trying to figure out what makes this messed-up place tick." She glanced both ways down the street. "You might as well come inside before someone sees you." Dean followed her into the workshop, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The space was larger than it appeared from outside, filled with machinery ranging from simple hand tools to complex contraptions he couldn't identify. "I'm Lena Cross," the woman said. "Everyone calls me Lenny. I keep things running around here, not that anything ever really breaks. Just pauses occasionally." She studied him intently. "You look like him, you know. Ezra. Same stubborn jaw." "You knew my great-grandfather?" Dean asked, surprised. Lenny snorted. "Everyone knew everyone in 1923. Town of 300 people doesn't leave much room for strangers." She picked up a wrench, twirling it absently. "I was 18 when it happened. Old enough to understand what was coming. Young enough To be ignored when I said it was a bad idea. What exactly happened? The journal mentions a ritual, but... The mirror bind, Lenny interrupted. Pike's grand scheme to make Grayvine prosperous forever found some ancient texts in the mine that talked about bending time, making one day last for generations of prosperity. Her voice hardened. What he got instead was this, a town trapped in an endless August 3rd. My great-grandfather tried to stop it. Lenny's expression softened slightly. Ezra was the only one besides me who saw it for what it was, playing, with forces we didn't understand. He and the Blackwood boy worked on some kind of counter-ritual right up until... She trailed off, eyes distant. Doesn't matter now, we're stuck. I need to see it, Dean said. The machine, the mirrors, whatever's keeping Grayvine trapped. Why? So you can be as helpless as the rest of us? Pike checks the mechanisms 3 times daily. The sheriff patrols the access points. No one gets in without permission. But you could, Dean pressed. You maintain the town, you must have access. Lenny studied him, weighing something behind sharp eyes. What makes you think you can do anything about it? Dozens have tried. Some disappeared completely, erased from the loop. Others lost their minds. A few, like Clara, kept hoping until hope itself became a kind of prison. Because I'm here, Dean said simply. Because Bristle, Eli, brought me here for a reason. Because my great-grandfather left a countermeasure, and I might be the only one who can implement it. A bark from outside startled them both. Peering through the window, Dean saw Bristle sitting alertly across the street, eyes fixed on the workshop. Lenny sighed deeply. He's watching for Pike's men. Clever, even as a dog. She set down her wrench and moved to a large cabinet. If Eli trusts you, that's something. But understand this, if we're caught, Pike won't just lock you up. He'll make sure you never existed at all. She unlocked the cabinet, revealing not tools but a narrow passageway carved into the stone foundation of the clock tower. The service. Tunnels connect most of the main buildings. Town's founders built them to move between places during the heavy snows. Pike uses them now to maintain his control. Dean followed Lenny into the darkness, the passage illuminated only by the beam of a brass lantern she carried. They moved in silence, descending deeper with each turning. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp stone and something metallic that reminded Dean of an operating room, the distinctive scent of copper and antiseptic. After what seemed like an hour but might have been minutes in Grayvine's distorted time, they reached a heavy iron door. Lenny produced a set of skeleton keys. Last chance to turn back, she warned. What's beyond isn't natural. Nothing about this place is natural, Dean replied. The door opened to reveal a vast circular chamber directly beneath the clock tower. Dean's breath caught in his throat. The entire space was lined with mirrors, hundreds of them arranged in concentric circles from floor to ceiling. At the center stood a complex apparatus, gears and clockwork surrounding a pedestal where a massive red crystal pulsed with inner light. The crystal rotated slowly, reflecting fractured light onto each mirror in sequence. Most disturbing were the images in the mirrors themselves. Each showed a different scene, not reflections of the chamber, but windows into other places, other times. Dean saw modern cities, rural landscapes, hospitals, schools, fragments of the world that had continued without Grayvine. The mirror bind, Lenny whispered. It lets us see outside but keeps us locked in. Every reflection is a moment that passed us by. Dean approached one mirror that seemed to show a surgical suite, eerily similar to the one where he'd lost young Mia. How does it work? Pike said the red quartz from the mine is attuned to temporal energy, whatever that means. The mirrors act as conduits, windows to the outside world that simultaneously reinforce our isolation. Lenny pointed to a complex network of gears connecting to the tower above. The clock mechanism powers it, keeps it synchronized with outside time, while we remain static. A movement caught Dean's attention, a shadow passing through a doorway, on the far side of the chamber. Dean tensed, but Lenny shook her head. Just the loop resetting. Happens every few hours. Nothing to worry about. but the shadow had looked familiar. "Is there another room through there?" Dean asked. Lenny hesitated. "The operating theater, where it all culminated. No one goes in there. Pike's orders." Dean was already moving toward the doorway, drawn by an instinct he couldn't explain. The journal burned against his chest, Ezra's final entry echoing in his mind. "I've hidden the countermeasure components where only Eli knows to look." "Dean, wait!" Lenny called, but he was already through the door. The operating theater was smaller than the mirror chamber, but no less disturbing. A central table dominated the space, its metal surface stained dark with what could only be blood. Surgical instruments lay arranged on a nearby tray, untouched for a century yet free of dust or corrosion. The walls here too were mirrored, but these showed only darkness, no reflections, no outside world. A soft whine drew Dean's attention to the corner. Bristle stood there, though Dean hadn't seen the dog follow them underground. The animal pawed insistently at a section of the wall. "How did he get in here?" Lenny whispered, having followed Dean into the room. Dean knelt beside Bristle, examining the wall section. A small panel, nearly invisible, was set into the baseboards. Dean pried it open, revealing a hidden compartment containing a tin box and a yellowed newspaper clipping. The clipping showed a black and white photograph of two people standing before the clinic, a bearded man in a physician's coat that Dean recognized from family photos as Ezra, and beside him, a boy of perhaps 12 with intelligent eyes and a serious expression. The caption read, "Dr. Holloway and assistant Eli Blackwood demonstrate new medical apparatus. August 1st, 1923. Dean looked from the photograph to Bristle, seeing for the first time the unmistakable intelligence in the dog's eyes, the same penetrating gaze as the boy in the picture. "Eli," Dean whispered, "what happened to you?" The dog made a soft, mournful sound. "The ritual transformed him," Lenny said quietly. "Some say because he was helping Ezra interfere. Others think it was deliberate. Pike's insurance that no one could undo what he'd done. Either way, Eli became something between worlds. Not quite human anymore, but not fully bound by the loop either." Dean opened the tin box with trembling hands. Inside lay detailed diagrams and notes in Ezra's handwriting, the countermeasure he'd prepared. The design showed modified mirrors, arranged in a pattern to reverse the energy flow of the mirror bind, with the red quartz positioned differently. "This could work," Dean murmured, excitement building as his medical mind analyzed the scientific principles behind Ezra's design. "With the right adjustments, we could potentially reverse the field and break the loop. Others have found Ezra's notes before," Lenny warned. "They all failed. The countermeasure requires something more than just mechanical adjustments." As if in answer, Bristle nudged a final document from the box, a letter addressed simply, "To my descendant." Dean broke the wax seal and read, "If you are reading this, you are of my blood and have been guided here by Eli, the only soul who can move freely between our world and yours. The mirror bind cannot be broken by force or science alone. It requires sacrifice not of life but of truth. What holds Gravine captive is not just Pike's machine, but the lies that brought us here. To break the cycle, you must first understand your own part in it. Our family carries this burden. I failed to stop what I helped create. Perhaps you will succeed where I could not." Ezra Holloway, August 3, 1923. "Helped create?" Dean repeated, confusion and dread mixing in equal measure. "What does that mean?" Before Lenny could answer, a low bell began to toll above, not the clock's hourly chime, but the curfew bell they'd heard the previous night. "That's not possible," Lenny whispered, fear evident in her voice. "It's not even noon." "Bristle, son," growled Hackles, rising. "Pike knows we're here," Lenny said, gathering the documents hurriedly. "We need to go now." As they rushed toward the exit, Dean glanced back at the operating table. For a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure lying there, a bearded man in a physician's coat, hands covered in blood, working desperately over a boy whose features kept shifting between human and canine. Then the vision vanished, leaving, only the stained table and the echoing toll of a bell that shouldn't be ringing. With Ezra's plans clutched to his chest and Bristle leading the way, Dean followed Lenny through the tunnels, the terrible truth beginning to dawn on him. His great-grandfather hadn't just tried to stop the mirror-bind ritual. He had helped create it. The alarm bell continued to toll as Dean, Lenny, and Bristle emerged from a hidden tunnel exit behind the general store. The streets of Grayvine had transformed once again, empty of ordinary townsfolk, now filled with men in matching dark coats moving with military precision. Mayor Pike's enforcers. "We need to get to the clinic," Dean said, clutching Ezra's papers. "Gather whatever supplies we need for the countermeasure." Lenny shook her head. "Too late. Look." Smoke rose from the direction of the clinic. Not the billowing clouds of a genuine fire, but thin wisps that hung unnaturally in the air, frozen in time like everything else in Grayvine. "Pike's burning your connection to the outside," Lenny whispered. "Trying to trap you fully in the loop." Dean felt the weight of the journal against his chest. At least they hadn't found that. "We need somewhere safe to study these plans." "There's only one place Pike and his men never go," Lenny said. "The cemetery." They moved through back alleys, Bristle leading the way with uncanny awareness of the enforcers' positions. The dog would stop, head cocked, then guide them safely around corners just before Pike's men would appear. Dean noticed how the animals' forms seemed to flicker occasionally, brief overlays of a human boy's outline superimposed on the canine body. The cemetery lay at Grayvine's western edge, surrounded by a wrought iron fence whose gate hung permanently open. Unlike a normal graveyard, this one was eerily uniform, every marker bearing the same date, August 3rd, 1923. "They're not real graves," Lenny explained as they slipped between the silent markers. When the loop began, Pike declared everyone, symbolically, dead to their former lives. The town created this place as a memorial to who we used to be. She led them to a secluded corner overhung by ancient willows. "But your great-grandfather's grave is different." In the furthest corner stood a simple stone, set apart from the others. The name had been crudely chiseled away, leaving only a single word: traitor. Pike had him erased, Lenny said quietly. After what happened with Eli, the town turned on Ezra. Some blamed him for causing the loop, others for failing to prevent it. The truth was probably somewhere in between. Dean knelt beside the desecrated marker. His letter said he helped create what he tried to stop. What did he mean? "The mirror-bind ritual needed a physician's knowledge," Lenny replied. Pike convinced Ezra it was theoretical research, a way to extend life for the ill. By the time Ezra realized the true purpose, the apparatus was nearly complete. Bristle whined, pawing at the grave's earth. Dean understood immediately and began to dig with his hands at the base of the stone. 6 inches down, his fingers struck metal, a small tin box similar to the one they'd found in the operating theater. The box contained several loose journal pages and a small leather pouch. The first page confirmed what Dean had begun to suspect. July 30th, 1923. "I've made a terrible mistake. The temporal focusing device I designed for medical treatments has been modified by Pike for the mirror-bind ritual. My knowledge of circulation and cellular preservation became the foundation for his mad scheme. I am complicit in whatever comes. Eli and I have been working night and day on a reversal mechanism, but we've hit an impasse. The ritual requires blood sacrifice to initiate. Would the reversal demand the same price?" Before Dean could read further, distant shouts echoed across the cemetery. At the main gate, Pike's voice carried through a megaphone. "Citizens of Grayvine, the outsider has stolen restricted documents and conspires to destabilize our temporal sanctuary. He must be apprehended immediately. Sheriff Harlan, secure the cemetery perimeter." Lenny pulled Dean deeper into the shelter of the willows. "They must have found the empty compartment. We need to move." "Not yet," Dean insisted, scanning the remaining pages. "There's something here about the sacrifice, what the reversal requires." A twig snapped nearby. Sheriff Harlan emerged from between the gravestones, revolver drawn but held pointing downward. His weathered face betrayed conflict. "Dr. Holloway," he said quietly. "The mayor's ordered your immediate arrest. Says you're planning to collapse. The loop." Dean stood slowly, the journal pages clutched in his hand. "And if I am? Would that be so terrible, Sheriff? 100 years in the same day, is that living?" Harlan's jaw tightened. "It's all we have. If the loop breaks, we might all just disappear, like smoke when the wind changes. Or you might finally be free," Dean countered. "My great-grandfather tried to stop this. He left a way out." "Ezra Holloway brought this on us," Harlan snapped, but doubt shadowed his eyes. "He and Pike together." "And I'm trying to undo it," Dean said, "but I need time, please." The sheriff stood frozen in indecision. Finally, he holstered his weapon with a sigh. "I never saw you," he muttered, "but they'll be here within minutes. Whatever you're planning, move fast." As Harlan disappeared back among the graves, Dean returned to the journal pages. The final entry made his blood run cold. August 3rd, 1923. "It's begun." Pike performed the initial binding with Eli's blood, said a child's sacrifice would anchor the loop for eternity. "I tried to stop him, but too late. The boy's not dead, but transformed. Caught between forms, between times. My reversal requires similar payment. Blood of my bloodline freely given. I've hidden the components, praying someday my family might return to finish what I started. The sacrifice needed isn't death, but truth, accepting responsibility for what we've done. I will attempt it myself tonight, though I fear Pike will intervene. If I fail, God sends someone who won't." "Eli was the sacrifice," Dean whispered, looking at Bristle with new understanding. "Pike used him to start the ritual." Bristle's eyes, too human, too knowing, met his in silent confirmation. "We need to get to the clock tower," Dean said, gathering the papers. "Tonight, during the curfew when the mechanism resets." Lenny's face had gone pale. "If you break the loop, what happens to us? We've been frozen for a century, Dean. The world's moved on. Where do we go? What do we become?" Before Dean could answer, the cemetery gate crashed open. Pike stood, there flanked by a dozen enforcers and a visibly reluctant Sheriff Harlan. "Bring them to the town square," Pike commanded. "Everyone will witness what happens to those who threaten our sanctuary." As the enforcers spread through the cemetery, Lenny grabbed Dean's arm. "There's another way out. Through the caretaker's shed. Come on." They ran, ducking between monuments, Bristle darting ahead. Behind them, Pike's voice rose in fury. "Find them. The Holloway line ends today." The caretaker's shed concealed another tunnel entrance. As they reached it, the town's central bell began to toll, not the alarm but the clock tower marking noon. Except the quality of light hadn't changed. It remained the strange, fixed morning illumination that had greeted Dean upon waking. "He's accelerating the loop," Lenny gasped as they entered the tunnel. "Pike's trying to reach the reset point faster." "Reset point?" "Midnight, when the loop fully restarts. He wants to complete a full cycle before you can implement the countermeasure. It erases anomalies like your arrival." They emerged from the tunnel near the town square, staying hidden behind a row of bushes. A crowd had gathered, the entire population of Grayvine, it seemed, surrounding a makeshift platform where Pike stood addressing them. "For a century we've been safe in our sanctuary," he proclaimed. "Untouched by war, disease, the degradation of the modern world. Now a Holloway returns to destroy what we've built, just as his ancestor tried to do. Will you allow it?" Murmurs of fear rippled through the crowd. But then a clear voice rang out. "You built nothing, Jonah. You trapped us." Clara Marin pushed through the crowd to stand before the platform. A century of silence seemed to fall away as she spoke. "You promised prosperity but delivered prison. You sacrificed a child and called it progress. You erased our chance to live." She turned to address the townsfolk. "I've been your teacher for 100 years of the same lessons. Don't you tire of the repetition? Don't you yearn for tomorrow?" Pike's face contorted with rage. "Arrest her. She's conspiring with the outsider." Sheriff Harlan stepped forward, but instead of taking Clara, he placed himself beside her. "No more, Jonah. We've followed you through an eternity of August. Clara's right, it's time for August 4th. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, divided between fear and hope. Pike's control was visibly slipping. "The ritual sustains us," he shouted. "Break it and we cease to exist. Is that what you want, to disappear into nothing?" "We're already nothing," Clara replied. "Ghosts repeating the same day forever. At least an ending would be something new." As Pike struggled to regain control, Dean whispered to Lenny, "The clock tower, how do we get in during all this?" "We don't," she replied. "The central mechanism can only be accessed at midnight when the loop resets. But there's another approach. The school basement has an old tunnel directly to the operating theater." Dean checked the final journal pages. "The ritual must be completed at the point of origin, where Eli was sacrificed. The operating theater is perfect." Bristle nudged Dean's hand, whining softly. The dog's eyes flicked toward the school, then back to the crowd where dissent was spreading. A clear message. "Go now, while Pike is distracted." They slipped away, circling the town square toward the schoolhouse. Behind them, the confrontation escalated, more voices joining Clara's, Pike's responses growing more frantic. The bell tower chimed again, 1 o'clock, though barely 30 minutes had passed. "Time's accelerating," Lenny said grimly. "Pike's pushing the loop toward reset." As they reached the schoolhouse, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows. Sheriff Harlan, breathing hard as if he'd run to intercept them. "Clara's created a diversion," he said. "But Pike's coming. With his loyalists. Whatever you're planning, you've got maybe an hour of real time before he reaches you." "Will you help us?" Dean asked. Harlan's weathered face showed a century of resignation finally breaking. 100 years is a long time to regret inaction, Doctor. I'll delay them as long as I can." As the sheriff departed, Dean, Lenny, and Bristle entered the silent schoolhouse. The classroom where Dean had first met Clara stood empty, the equations still perfect on the board. Lenny led them to a supply closet in the back, revealing a trapdoor hidden beneath stacked chairs. "This town has more secrets than people," Dean remarked as they descended into darkness. "When you're trapped in one day forever," Lenny replied, "you spend a lot of time digging, both literally and figuratively." The tunnel was narrow, requiring them to proceed single file. Bristle led, then Dean, with Lenny bringing up the rear. As they moved deeper, Dean noticed the dog's form flickering more frequently between canine and human, the boundary between states weakening as they approached the ritual site. "Lenny," Dean said hesitantly, "if we succeed, if the loop breaks, what do you want to happen?" Her footsteps paused momentarily. "Honestly, I don't know. I was 18 when time stopped. The world I knew is gone, but at least whatever comes next would be real." Her voice softened. "Even if we just end, at least it would be an ending we chose." Ahead, Bristle barked once. They had reached the operating theater, as Dean prepared to face whatever came. Next, he realized the true sacrifice his great-grandfather had written about. Not blood, but choice. The courage to face consequences, to accept an unknown future over a certain but static present. The bell tower chimed 3 o'clock. Pike was accelerating time, racing toward midnight's reset. The final confrontation was coming, and the fate of Grayvine, its trapped souls, its impossible physics, its century of endless August 3rd, would soon rest on what happened in the chamber ahead. The operating theater gleamed with unnatural precision as Dean, Lenny, and Bristle emerged from the tunnel. The blood-stained table at its center seemed to pulse with a subtle rhythm that matched the turning of the red quartz crystal visible through the doorway to the mirror chamber. Everything was connected, Dean realized. The clock tower, the mirrors, the operating theater where Eli had been transformed. A perfect circuit of frozen time. "We need to reset the mirrors according to Ezra's diagram," Dean said, unfolding the Siam brittle papers. "The pattern creates a resonance that should destabilize the mirror bind." Lenny examined the schematics. This would reverse the flow completely, not just break the loop, but unravel it. Her hands trembled slightly. One chance? Dean. Get it wrong and we might tear reality apart instead of fixing it. The bell tower chimed 4 times, though they'd been in the tunnels less than 20 minutes. Pike was compressing time aggressively now, racing toward midnight's reset. As they began repositioning the smaller mirrors from the operating theater, walls, footsteps echoed from the main chamber. Dean tensed, expecting Pike's enforcers, but instead Clara emerged, followed by Sheriff Harlan. Both looked harried, but determined. "Pike's gathering his loyalists," Clara said without preamble. "They're coming. Curtis bought us some time by sealing the main access doors." Harlan nodded grimly. "Not much time, though. Pike knows these tunnels better than anyone." "Then we work fast," Dean said, handing portions of the diagram to each of them. "Clara, help me with these mirrors. Lenny, Sheriff, we need the crystal repositioned precisely." They worked with desperate efficiency, rearranging the elements according to Ezra's design. Each mirror had to be angled precisely, each connection between the operating theater and the main chamber carefully calibrated. Bristle moved between them, his form flickering more visibly now. Sometimes dog, sometimes the ghostly outline of a boy, as if the approaching ritual was already weakening the boundaries that trapped him. The bell tower chimed 5 times, then 6 in rapid succession. Outside, darkness fell instantly, the unnatural progression of time visible through the few mirrors that showed the town above. "He's pushing us toward midnight," Clara said, fear edging her voice. "If the loop resets before we complete this..." A thunderous crash interrupted her, the sound of the main chamber doors being forced open. Angry voices echoed through the complex. "Holloway," Pike's voice carried clearly, twisted with rage. "Stop this madness. You'll destroy us all." Harlan drew his revolver. "I'll hold them at the inner door. Finish the ritual." "I'll help," Clara said, joining the sheriff at the doorway. "Lenny knows the mechanism better than I do." Dean worked frantically, aligning the final mirrors while Lenny positioned the red quartz according to the diagram. Bristle sat at the center of the pattern they'd created, his form now shifting continuously between dog and boy, neither fully present. The sound of confrontation erupted from the outer chamber. Pike's demands, Harlan's steady refusals, Clara's clear voice trying to reason with the townspeople who had followed their mayor. "It's ready," Lenny announced, stepping back from the completed arrangement. Light from the quartz now bounced between the mirrors in a complex pattern, creating a web of illumination that centered on Bristle. The bell tower chimed 7, 8, 9 times in quick succession. They were running out of time. Dean retrieved the final component from the leather pouch they'd found at Ezra's grave. A small crystal shard, twin to the larger one but blood red rather than clear. According to the journal, it had been taken from the original before the mirror bind initiated. A failsafe Ezra had hidden away. "What now?" Lenny asked, eyeing the doorway where the sounds of struggle intensified. Dean read from the final instructions. "The reversal requires sacrifice freely given. Blood of my blood, truth for truth, grief for grief. I need to place this shard in the center and offer something." "What kind of something?" Lenny pressed, but Dean's attention had shifted. The mirrors surrounding them had begun to change, no longer reflecting the chamber but showing scenes from Dean's life. His medical school graduation, his wedding day, the birth of his son, the funeral, the failed surgery that had driven him into the wilderness. Interspersed were images he didn't recognize. A bearded man working in this very chamber, a young boy assisting him, an argument with a younger version of Pike. "Ezra," Dean whispered. "I'm seeing Ezra's memories too." The bell tolled 10 times. 11. Midnight approached. In the outer chamber, a gunshot rang out, followed by Clara's cry. The inner door burst open and Pike stormed in, followed by a handful of loyal enforcers. Harlan lay wounded in the doorway, Clara kneeling beside him. "Stop this immediately," Pike commanded, his eyes wild with fear and fury. "It's too late, Jonah," Clara called from the doorway. "Let it happen. Let us be free." Pike lunged toward the arrangement of mirrors, but Lenny intercepted him. Enough, Pike. 100 years of your control is enough. As they struggled, Dean knelt beside Bristle, the shard in his outstretched palm. The mirrors around them spun faster with images now. Past, present, might-have-beens, dizzying in their speed and intensity. The bell began to toll for midnight, each chime shaking the foundations of the chamber. I don't know what to give, Dean admitted to Bristle. What sacrifice is enough? The dog, no, the boy, gazed at him with eyes that had seen a century pass in a single day. In them, Dean saw understanding beyond words. The final piece clicked into place. It's not about giving something up, Dean realized aloud. It's about letting go. The images in the mirrors slowed, focusing on two parallel scenes. Ezra kneeling over young Eli on the operating table, desperately trying to save him after Pike's ritual went wrong. Dean in his modern surgical suite, hands bloody as he fought to save young Mia Cortez while monitors flatlined around him. Both physicians, both failing, both carrying the weight of lives they couldn't save. With sudden clarity, Dean understood the true nature of the sacrifice. He placed the crystal shard in Bristle's paw, hand, and spoke words that came not from Ezra's journal but from his own heart. I accept what I couldn't change. I release the guilt I've carried. Not to forget, but to move forward. His voice broke slightly. My son Jacob, Mia Cortez. I did everything I could for them, just as Ezra did everything he could for Eli and for Grayvine. The crystal shard flared with brilliant light. Bristle's form stabilized briefly as a boy, perhaps 12 years old with intelligent eyes and an old soul's wisdom, before dissolving into pure light that spread through the web of mirrors. No! Pike screamed, breaking free from Lenny and lunging toward Dean. You'll unravel everything. But he never reached his target. As Pike crossed the threshold of the ritual pattern, his form seemed to stutter, freeze-framing in multiple overlapping versions of himself, young, old, hopeful, tyrannical, before shattering like glass, fragments dissolving into the light that now filled the chamber. The bell's final toll reverberated through the foundations of Grayvine, but instead of completing the cycle, it hung in the air, stretching into a sustained note that seemed to pierce reality itself. Around them, the mirrors began to crack one by one, each fracture releasing more light until the chamber blazed like the heart of a star. Dean shielded his eyes, reaching blindly for Lenny. We need to leave, now. Where? She called back, her voice distorted as if coming through water. There's nowhere to go. The ravine, Clara answered, supporting the injured sheriff. If anything reconnects to your world, it would be there. The chamber walls were dissolving now, the entire underground complex becoming transparent as boundaries between spaces broke down. Through the fading architecture, Dean could see straight upward through the clock tower to a night sky where stars finally moved, streaking across the darkness as time accelerated. Grayvine was catching up to the present. This way, Dean called, helping Harlan while Clara took Lenny's hand. Follow me. They ascended not through tunnels or stairs, but through spaces that folded into one another. The operating theater becoming the school classroom, becoming the town square in the span of footsteps. Around them, Grayvine's buildings flickered between states, new, old, decayed, rebuilt, finally settling into the weathered ruins they should have become after a century of abandonment. The townsfolk they passed were similarly transforming, some aging rapidly before vanishing like smoke, others remaining solid but changed, as if a century of paused development had suddenly been allowed to express itself. No sign remained of Pike or his enforcers. What's happening to everyone? Dean asked as they raced toward the edge of town. Becoming what they would have been, Clara answered, her own face subtly shifting, lines appearing around her eyes, hair streaking with silver. Or what they always were, beneath the loop. They reached the town's edge as Grayvine continued to unravel behind them. The forest path that had been obscured now reappeared, leading toward where the ravine should be. A familiar bark drew their attention. Bristle, fully dog once more, waited at the trailhead. "He's showing us the way out," Dean said. As they followed Bristle into the forest, Dean looked back one last time at Grayvine. The town was transforming into ghostly outlines, buildings and streets becoming transparent as they settled into their proper place in time. Ruins long abandoned, a footnote in history rather than a prison outside it. Clara squeezed his hand, her form now that of an elderly woman, but her eyes still clear and knowing. "Thank you," she whispered. The ravine appeared ahead, spanning the same impossible gap Dean had crossed days earlier. But now, instead of mist, a bridge of light connected the two sides, ephemeral, fading, but still crossable. "Quickly," Dean urged. "It's breaking down." They hurried across the light bridge, the boundary between worlds growing thinner with each step. Behind them, Grayvine completed its transformation. A century of frozen time finally released in a cascade of consequences neither Dean nor Ezra could have fully predicted. As they reached the far side, the bridge dissolved. The ravine itself began to close, the impossible geography resolving into ordinary forest. Dean turned to check on his companions, but where 4 people and a dog had crossed, he now stood alone among the trees. "Clara? Lenny? Sheriff?" he called, panic rising. A soft whine answered him. Bristle sat nearby, the only one who had made the crossing with him. But even the dog seemed different now, more ordinary, the uncanny intelligence. In his eyes faded to simple canine loyalty. The ritual had been reversed. The loop was broken, and Dean was left with nothing but memories of a town that time, and the world, had finally been allowed to forget. Dean awoke to the sound of rain pattering against canvas. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented by the ordinary comfort of his sleeping bag. His tent, his original tent at his original campsite, enclosed him in its familiar confines. Weak morning light filtered through the fabric, casting everything in a gentle gray glow. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination born of grief and isolation? He sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. His hand went automatically to his side, where he found a fresh scar, a long, thin line that hadn't been there before following Bristle into the forest. Not a dream, then. Dean unzipped the tent and emerged into the clearing. His campsite appeared undisturbed, cook stove in place, bear canister secured, everything exactly as he'd left it. The morning fog lingered among the trees, ordinary in its opacity, nothing like the sentient mist that had concealed the ravine. "Bristle?" he called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. No response. No rustle of movement in the undergrowth. No watchful eyes from the tree line. Dean checked his watch. 8:17 a.m., October 21st. According to the date, he'd been gone for 4 days, though his experience in Grayvine had felt both longer and shorter, time stretching and compressing in ways his mind still struggled to process. He reached into his jacket pocket, half expecting to find nothing. Instead, his fingers closed around the weathered leather of Ezra's journal. He withdrew it with a mixture of relief and apprehension, flipping through pages that now seemed more fragile in the natural light. The handwriting of his great-grandfather, a tangible connection to what he'd experienced. After a simple breakfast, Dean packed his gear methodically, his surgeon's precision returning as he prepared to hike back to civilization. While striking the tent, he noticed something half buried in the fallen leaves, a small piece of red quartz, identical to the shard he'd placed in Bristle's paw during the ritual. He pocketed it without thinking, a talisman of proof. The journey back took most of the day, each step carrying him further from Grayvine and deeper into a world that had never known its fate. The forest gradually thinned, trails appeared, and by late afternoon Dean reached the ranger station where his journey had begun. The same ranger who had issued his backcountry permit looked up in surprise. "Dr. Holloway, we were about to send out a search party. You're 3 days overdue." "Lost track of time," Dean replied, the understatement almost making him smile. "Happens to the best of us out there," she said, accepting his explanation without question. "Find what you were looking for?" Dean considered the question for a moment, Not what I expected, he finally answered, but maybe what I needed. He spent the night in a motel on the edge of the nearest town, the softness of the bed almost uncomfortable after the forest floor and Ezra's spare cot. The hot shower washed away the physical remnants of his journey, but nothing could rinse away the memories. The mirrored chamber, Clara's knowing eyes, Lenny's pragmatic courage, Bristle's dual nature, and the moment when Grayvine had unraveled around them. The next morning, Dean visited the County Historical Society, a small building that doubled as a local library. The elderly archivist seemed delighted by his interest in regional history. Grayvine? She repeated when he inquired. Now there's a name I haven't heard in years. One of our local mysteries. She retrieved a thin folder containing newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and handwritten accounts. The headlines told fragments of the story Dean now knew in full. Logging town mysteriously abandoned. August 1923. Search parties find no trace of Grayvine residents. County declares Grayvine officially missing. All 317 residents unaccounted. For a grainy photograph showed the town in its prime. The clock tower, the general store, the schoolhouse where he'd met Clara. Another showed search parties combing the area where the town had stood, finding nothing but foundations and a few scattered possessions. The most peculiar mass disappearance in state history, the archivist explained. Theories ranged from mass hysteria to government experiments to some kind of environmental disaster. But no bodies were ever found, no refugees ever identified. And now? Dean asked. What's at the site today? Nothing much. Forest reclaimed most of it. Hikers occasionally find old foundations, bits of metal. There was talk of an archaeological survey a few years back, but funding fell through. She studied him with sudden interest. You have a personal connection? Dean hesitated. Family history, he said finally. My great-grandfather may have lived there briefly. What was his name? I could check our records. Holloway. Dr. Ezra Holloway. The archivist's eyes widened slightly. The physician. Yes, he's mentioned in several accounts as being among the missing. There was some speculation he might have been involved somehow, as he'd only arrived in town a few months before the disappearance. Dean left with photocopies of the articles, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. History remembered Grayvine, if only as an unsolved mystery. And it remembered Ezra, though not his desperate attempt to undo what he had helped create. That evening, Dean made one more stop before leaving the area. The Seattle cemetery was quiet in the fading light, autumn leaves skittering across manicured lawns. He found Jacob's grave easily, the small headstone as familiar to him as his own reflection, though he had visited only a handful of times since the funeral. Dean knelt, brushing leaves from the stone. For the first time since his son's death, words came easily. I've been running, Jake, he said softly. From you, from myself, from everything that hurt too much to face. He traced the carved letters of his son's name. But running just leads to more wilderness, more emptiness. He told Jacob about Grayvine, about Bristle, about Clara and Lenny and a town trapped in endless repetition. He spoke of Ezra's failure and redemption, of Pike's fear disguised as control, of the moment when he had finally released his guilt in the operating theater. I couldn't save you, Dean admitted, his voice breaking. Just like I couldn't save Mia. Just like Ezra couldn't save Eli. Not completely. But that doesn't mean I failed. It means I'm human. He took a deep breath. And it's time I started living, again. As darkness fell completely, Dean drove back to his apartment in Seattle. The space felt different somehow, not filled with joy, but no longer suffocating with grief. He unpacked Ezra's journal and the red quartz shard, placing them on his desk beside a photograph of Jacob. 3 days later, Dean contacted the hospital. The leave of absence he had taken after Mia's death would end. He would return to the operating room, to saving those he could while accepting that some would still slip away despite his best efforts. That night, Dean dreamed of Grayvine. Not as he had last seen it unraveling into ruin, but as it might have been. Clara teaching children who grew older with each lesson. Lenny working on machines that evolved with passing time. Sheriff Harlan watching over a town that changed and lived rather than repeated and stagnated. He woke just before dawn, drawn to the window by some instinct he couldn't name. Outside, the park across from his apartment building lay shrouded in pre-morning mist. At its edge, barely visible in the gathering light, sat a familiar silhouette. Bristle. The dog watched the building with the same patient stillness he had shown outside Dean's tent, neither approaching nor retreating. As Dean studied him through the glass, Bristle's ears perked forward, his head tilting slightly as if in recognition. Dean's hand went to the red quartz in his pocket. The reversal of the ritual should have restored the natural order, should have released Eli from his transformation. Yet here was Bristle, or something that looked exactly like him, watching from across the barrier of ordinary reality. For a moment, Dean considered rushing downstairs, crossing the park, confirming what his eyes were telling him. Before he could decide, a jogger passed along the path. When they had gone, Bristle had vanished. But Dean understood the message in the dog's brief appearance. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. Some bonds transcend the barriers between worlds. And some memories, like Gravine's impossible day, like Jacob's too short life, deserve to be carried forward rather than left behind. Dean turned from the window and began preparing for his first day back at the hospital. The weight of Ezra's journal and the small red quartz remained with him, tangible reminders of a place that time had forgotten, but that he never would. Outside, in the gradually brightening park, a set of paw prints led away from the building, before disappearing into ordinary earth, leaving no trace of their maker, save in the heart of the one who remembered. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.